professionalism wears a particular perfume, citrus and caution. It greeted every morning alongside card swipes and elevator chimes, a choreography of polite greetings and tidy boundaries. Meetings ran on time, emails answered themselves in precise sentences, and faces learned to hold expressions that said just enough and nothing more. Then came the day the glance stayed too long. A simple thing, harmless to anyone else, but the air knew. Time didn't stop. It leaned in. He stood at the head of the table, notes squared to the edge, pen aligned like a compass finding north. The room, glass walls, city humming beyond, held that familiar hum of industry. Keyboards, softly cleared throats, the rustle of printed decks. Questions moved around like careful waiters, serving data without spilling feeling. And then a question landed where it wasn't supposed to. Not on the agenda, but in the space where attention becomes regard. Eyes lifted, met, lingered. A fraction of a second longer than manners allow. Nothing was said, yet something answered. What changed first was gravity. The floor felt truer under footfalls. The clock sounded louder. The fluorescent lights softened at the edges. Even the whiteboard seemed to listen. It wasn't about power. It was about orbit. The subtle pull between two bodies deciding whether to pretend they hadn't noticed or admit that they had. Work continued like rain, steady, professional, unremarkable. Still, inside the weather, a warm front formed. Boundaries were respected. That became the quiet miracle. Respect made room for what the world would not have forgiven without it. Morning check-ins stayed strictly about work, but the tone, so gentle, turned status updates into small shelters. How's the timeline? Could mean, are you sleeping? Let's reframe the milestone, sometimes sounded suspiciously like, let's not hurt. Emails remained crisp, immaculate. Yet the space between subject line and signature held a tenderness that no font could hide. It was the kindness of someone moving furniture, so another would not bump into it in the dark. Numbers and forecasts and roadmaps. These kept hands busy while hearts learned a new alphabet. He praised the work, never the person. Yet the person felt seen all the same. In a world where titles often arrive first and humanity second, humanity slipped ahead of its station. It showed up in the way he listened without interrupting, in how he let silence do most of the thinking. Control lived there, yes, but not the kind that crushes. The kind that steadies a ladder while someone climbs. There were days when fatigue dressed everything in grayscale. Deadlines were a drumbeat in the bones, and coffee tasted like compromise. On those days, a single nod from across the room felt like a coat placed gently on tired shoulders. The nod said, "Pace yourself." The nod said, "I see the weight you aren't naming." Unseen care became a current under the formal surface. Small gestures redirecting storms before they formed. People notice more than they admit. A meeting ran long, and a joke uncoiled from somewhere unpracticed. Laughter escaped, the kind that surprises the mouth. Heads turned. He smiled, surprised too, and something in the room loosened its tie. The tiniest fracture in the wall of roles, repaired at once by patience. No whispers, no spectacle. The moment went back to its drawer, folded neatly, but the fabric remembered the crease. Rules stood like signage in a museum. Do not touch. Stay behind the rope. It wasn't defiance to stand near the paintings and breathe. Proximity itself felt dangerous and undeniable. Elevator rides became small proofs of discipline. Shoulder to shoulder, eyes forward, the floor numbers blinking their progress like discreet secrets. Fiction would have asked for a dramatic brush of hands. Real life offered something stranger and more intimate. A shared stillness, each breath aware of the other. The world contained and mercifully quiet. The glance, the original one, kept returning in different clothes. During a quarterly review when the slide wouldn't load and he waited, unruffled, allowing failure to stand in the room and not be shamed. During a fire drill when the whole team swarmed the sidewalk and he found no reason to stand close, yet didn't wander far. During a late-night sprint when the office emptied and the city put on its jewelry, and he brought 2 mugs from the break room as if that were strategy. No questions asked that would press too hard. No advice offered that would replace agency. Just presence. the rarest resource. The heart, traitorous and wise, began to measure time differently. Not in hours and deliverables, but in pulses of recognition, how the voice softened on good work, how a gaze would break first out of sheer courtesy, how the door was always held, never as a performance, always as a practice. The body knew to keep its seat, to keep its tone, to keep dignity as a desk plant watered carefully at week's end. Yet underneath, a garden no policy could map put out its first green leaf. One evening, the office emptied into a violet haze. The last printer settled into silence. The city breathed in neon. A deck needed one more pass before morning. He stayed, not hovering, not directing, just there. Screens reflected in glass like second thoughts. "We can push the non-critical," he said, and the phrase sounded like mercy. The pen clicked closed. He leaned against the table at a respectful distance, elbows a small bow of exhaustion. The fluorescent lights clicked to a warmer setting, and for a heartbeat the room felt like a chapel. Work as devotion, people as sacred. No touch crossed any line. Still, the skin learned a new warmth. The warmth of competence nearby, of steadiness within reach. The warmth of someone who refuses to make the room about himself when it is clearly about the work and the people doing it. Magnetic, yes, but the magnetism of care, not conquest. In that field, broken pieces, long kept apart by caution, contemplated the possibility of becoming whole shapes again. What frightened most wasn't scandal. It was truth. The truth that connection this precise is rare in any context, let alone one with lanyards and org charts. The truth that safety can feel like danger when the nervous system has only ever equated intensity with interest. The truth that eyes can become a home even when every manual says homes are for after hours. Truth doesn't negotiate. It simply stands there and asks to be believed. People say power is intoxicating. Perhaps. But what intoxicated here was restraint. Watching someone choose gentleness when impatience would have succeeded faster. Watching leadership arrive as listening instead of performance. Watching authority remove obstacles quietly, then step back as if erasing footprints. It was impossible not to learn from that, to find a better posture in one's own skin. He never asked for trust. He earned it the long way. Through small consistencies that make a life. The meeting that ended when promised. The message answered even when the news wasn't convenient. The apology delivered before it was demanded. Two orbits can collide with fireworks and debris. These orbits adjusted, made room, found a shared path that didn't require anyone to burn up to stay warm. And yet, there was heat. Honest, careful, unmistakable. It lived in the second before a door opened, in the throat when a name hovered there and chose the safer title instead. It lived in choosing not to share an elevator when it would have made the day harder, and choosing to share a silence when it would make the evening easier. Heat as reverence. Heat as a promise never spoken and therefore never betrayed. When the big launch finally happened, celebrations scattered through the building like confetti trying to be snow. Noise, glittering and deserved. In the middle of it, a glance found its old line across the room and walked it. The look didn't linger any longer than the first time. It simply carried more history now, more discipline, more gratitude, more unspent words shaped like blessings. Glasses clinked. Compliments landed and flew. Somewhere in the curve of that moment, an understanding set down roots. Some rules exist to keep harm out, others to keep love small. The trick is knowing which to honor and which to outgrow. Later, leaving, the lobby doors inhaled the night air and released it across the marble. He let the crowd surge past, then matched a pace that wasn't rushed. Outside, the city unrolled its lights like a map of all the ways people try to find one another. A car eased to the curb. There were a dozen goodbyes practiced for these thresholds. None were needed. One look held, steady and clean, and everything that had started with a glance became a quiet vow to protect what mattered most. The truth that had arrived without permission and taught two hearts a better way to stay. Some beginnings do not explode. They align. The room learned a new kind of quiet. Not the kind that follows bad news or the kind that comes when a clock forgets to tick. This quiet came before something true, the breath that lingers between command and confession. Schedules stacked neatly, agendas printed, names around a table like coordinates on a map. The work moved as it always did, targets, roadmaps, assumptions to test. And still, the air began to pulse, faint at first, with the heat of things better left unsaid and too real to ignore. Meetings changed their shape without changing their length. Sharp edges blurred. The vocabulary of certainty, deliverables, dependencies, deadlines, made room for softer syntax. Perhaps let's watch what would help. The slide deck was the same deck, but the space between bullets felt wider, more honest. A voice that used to land like a gavel began to land like a hand placed palm down on a table. Steady, warm, asking nothing more than attention freely given. There is a moment when authority loosens its tie and becomes care. It can't be taught, but it can be recognized, the way a question stops being a test and turns into an invitation. "Walk me through it," said without theater. Turned the maze of a plan into a corridor with light. Pauses lengthened, not as a tactic but as a courtesy. Thought was allowed to arrive at its own pace, carry its own weight. Confidence no longer flexed. It exhaled, restraint learned to make room for mercy. A missed metric didn't become a spectacle. It became a problem to solve together. A difficult email didn't turn into an echo inside the skull. It became a conversation with the door slightly closed so dignity wouldn't draft. There is tenderness in the way feedback can be placed on the table like bread rather than thrown like stones. That tenderness rewrote the nervous system. Muscles trained for flinch learned another lesson. Relax, speak, be heard. Control did not disappear. It softened its posture. Strategies still had spines, decisions still held. But inside that structure, something human stretched and woke. A glance met across a spreadsheet, steady and unhurried, held just long enough to say, "Not alone in this." The glance did not break the rules. It simply reminded them they are tools, not gods. The elevator became a tiny theater of discipline. Two bodies, the hum of cables, the glow of floor numbers counting toward normalcy, hands at sides, eyes on the seam of the doors, the distance between shoulders measured to the inch. And still the air changed, the slightest increase in temperature, an electricity that didn't shock so much as alert. No touch, no words. Only breath occupying the same square of silence and learning not to be afraid of its own sound. Emails grew polite to the point of poetry. Thank you landed like relief. Good catch landed like regard. The signature line, best, then a name, began to feel less like a boundary and more like a promise. This conversation will still be here tomorrow. The late-night message that might have demanded arrived in morning light instead. Proof that urgency can choose respect and still get everything it needs. Some days drew the line brighter. Policy posted itself like weather alerts. Reports were filed. Doors for appearance's sake stayed open. Lines on the floor of a gym teach form. These lines taught form too. The body learned how to move within them without becoming smaller. That was the miracle, discipline without diminishment. Even the spine felt taller for it. In the war room, weeks before launch, air tasted of ink and coffee and the faint metallic spark of effort. Whiteboards filled and emptied and filled again. Precision became prayer. In the middle of it, a pause. A voice low enough to steady the room. Breathe. We're close. It sounded like authority. It felt like belonging. The pulse in the wrist answered first, then the mind. On a Tuesday, a storm pressed its face to the windows, and the city blurred into watercolor. The office lighting failed into something kinder. The day ran long, then longer. People peeled away until the floor plan felt like an empty stage after curtain call. A final review sprawled, tabs open like unmade beds. He stood a careful distance away, not hovering, not withdrawing. Control held the frame. Surrender shaded the colors inside it. We can let this piece slip a sprint, arrived not as indulgence but as wisdom. Nothing worth keeping becomes itself in a rush. Coffee appeared without ceremony. 2 mugs, steam rising like surrender that had nothing to do with giving up. Fingers brushed in the handoff, a near miss calibrated by instinct. A breath forgot what it was doing. Then it remembered. The balance returned, but different now, like a tightrope walker who knows the net is there and therefore steps more beautifully. Conversations found a second layer. One only tone could read. "Do you need anything else from me?" Could mean range of motion or room to fall apart. Answers chose safety without saying so. That is the eloquence of restraint. It builds a place where truth will arrive uncoerced. And truth did arrive, slowly, almost shy. Long days were not heroic. They were heavy. Perfection was not noble. It was exhausting. The work mattered. So did the people doing it. Control nodded at every admission. Surrender set it gently on a chair and brought water. Rumor wandered the hallways like a cat, curious, persuasive, easily spooked by eye contact. Imagination staged scenes in conference rooms no one had actually entered. The antidote was simple, undramatic, more work done well, more kindness with no audience, more clear-eyed accountability that made gossip look clumsy. One by one, whispers ran out of oxygen. The line kept moving, but not like a trap. More like a tide that rises and falls, asking attention rather than obedience. Some hours called for command. Others asked for listening that stayed until the last sentence found its ending. Control and surrender exchanged jackets all day long, each looking somehow better in the other's clothes. Near midnight, the city exhaled. Streets thinned to their bones. From the 21st floor, tail lights stitched a red rosary across the avenue. Inside the glass, reflections overlapped, screen over face over sky. "That's enough for tonight," came without question mark, and the word enough loosened something old and tight around the heart. Jackets lifted from chairs, screens darkened. The office returned to its quiet animal self. The elevator again, the soft sigh of descent. Shoulders almost close enough to feel heat. That precarious closeness where everything could tip into a story that would not survive daylight. Control held the door with one finger. Surrender stood up straighter. At the lobby, a small crowd, the brisk choreography of leaving. Outside, a wind sharp enough to wake the kindest kind of caution. The car arrived. A door opened. No invitation disguised as chivalry. No performance of distance. Only the right gesture, the right timing, the right goodbye. In the week that followed, the line learned new grace. Meetings landed on time and ended sooner than they had to. Praise distributed itself where it belonged. Ownership became a shared verb. Strain, when it showed, found a place to sit without being shamed for sitting. The air felt lighter because nothing forbidden was happening, and everything honest was. What breaks in stories like this is not always a boundary. Sometimes it is loneliness. Sometimes it is the belief that power must arrive with a closed fist. Sometimes it is the habit of mistaking intensity for care. Each of those broke quietly. In their place stood an agreement made without signatures. This connection will protect the work and the people doing it. Discipline would be the guardian. Tenderness would be the teacher. There will always be a silence before something breaks. The mercy here was learning that the breaking did not have to be a fall. It could be a shift, the moment a rigid frame makes room for breath. Presence pulled, gravity answered, and two careful orbits kept the sky without burning. And so the line held, not as a threat, but as a promise. Rules built walls high enough to reach reason, but emotion still found its way through the cracks. It began quietly, in the ordinary rhythm of days that looked the same but felt different. Distance became the only safe lie, the kind you tell yourself when truth feels too dangerous to hold. Every good morning sounded heavier than it should. Every polite exchange carried more weight than any word could safely bear. The office had always been about order, structured schedules, deliberate routines, carefully chosen words. Yet beneath the hum of computers and muted footsteps, something unspoken lived. It wasn't loud enough to be named, but it was alive, steady, patient. Glances turned into pauses, pauses turned into sentences that hovered a little too close to meaning. Reason built the walls. Emotion drew maps of every place where light still got in. Distance was supposed to protect. It became the new ritual, standing just far enough to keep things appropriate, to let eyes meet only by accident. Still, no rule ever protected anyone from the small betrayals of their own heartbeat. There were moments when silence pressed too hard against the ribs, when professionalism felt like a costume that no longer fit. The longer the distance held, the louder the truth became. He was measured in everything he did, his voice even, his hands steady, his presence constant but never invasive. That steadiness should have made it easier. Instead, it made it harder. Safety can be a dangerous thing when the heart starts to mistake it for belonging. It wasn't power that drew the line between them, it was fear. The fear of losing what the world allowed for something the world would not forgive. There were days when staying apart felt like an act of strength. Meetings stayed formal, smiles rehearsed, the distance perfectly calibrated. But inside, there was motion, a pull that no logic could dismiss. A look shared across a conference table carried more confession than any sentence could hold. When words became impossible, silence did the speaking. It told the truth softly, but it told it every time. Rules existed for a reason. They kept the world neat, manageable, predictable. They said don't cross, but rules never accounted for loneliness, for what happens when two people learn each other's rhythm without meaning to. Loneliness doesn't sign contracts. It finds warmth where it can. It finds kindness and calls it home. There were moments when distance felt merciful, a way to keep the fragile balance intact. There were also nights when distance felt like punishment, like holding your breath for too long. A single text about work could make the chest tighten, not because of what it said, but because of who it was from. The words were harmless. It was the heart that wasn't. Days blurred into weeks, and pretending became an art form. How was your weekend? Had to sound like small talk, not like curiosity. Good job had to carry the same tone for everyone, even when it meant something different to one. The body learned restraint, but emotion kept rehearsing rebellion behind closed eyes. It wasn't desire for possession. It was the ache of recognition, the quiet knowing that someone out there understood without needing explanation. When distance is both shield and wound, it becomes impossible to tell whether it saves or destroys. The polite space between them became sacred ground, a place where they could exist safely and never fully live. Every act of restraint was a kind of confession, every withheld glance an unspoken vow. It was a strange sort of intimacy, one built not on touch, but on everything withheld. There were moments when the temptation to cross that space almost broke through. A late meeting, the sound of rain against glass, a word of comfort spoken too softly. But both knew that once truth steps past the door, it never leaves quietly. So they let it stay where it was, alive, beating quietly, unacknowledged but undeniable. The world would never understand this kind of love, the kind that doesn't demand, that doesn't need to be seen to exist. It was built out of boundaries and breathing room, of caring deeply and stepping back. Some loves bloom in the light. Others learn to live in the shade, because the shade is the only place they're allowed to survive. Distance wasn't failure. It was protection. The kind that hurts but preserves. Every unspoken word became an act of care. Every goodbye disguised as professionalism became proof of respect. The heart learned to love quietly, to keep its tenderness folded like a letter that can never be mailed. There's a particular kind of ache that doesn't destroy. It refines. It teaches patience, discipline, and the strange art of loving without expectation. When care becomes larger than desire, when respect stands stronger than longing, that's when distance stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like devotion. In the end, they both learned what few ever do, that love isn't always the breaking of rules. Sometimes it's the grace to hold them gently, to love within the limits without letting the heart harden. Some distances aren't meant to be closed. They exist to remind us that connection doesn't need proximity to be real. And so, the lie stayed, not because it wasn't love, but because it was. Morning arrived without color, a grayscale Monday with a to-do list that already felt like a reprimand. Launch week. Everyone moved faster, spoke quicker, and pretended not to notice the nerves in one another's hands. The conference room was too bright, the deck too long, the stakes too loud. The day had the teeth of a storm that hadn't decided whether to break or pass. Failure came small at first. A number in a data pull that didn't match the dashboard. A link in the prototype that led to an old screen. A minuscule misalignment that, under the fluorescent insistence of expectation, looked like treachery. My name surfaced in a thread I hadn't seen. A question mark landed like a stone. The familiar metallic taste of self-defense rose in the mouth. Explanations arranging themselves, apologies composing their neat, miserable sentences. He could have let it happen. Leadership often means letting gravity do its work. He could have watched the room turn, let the narrative calcify, and then arrived at the end with polished neutrality. Instead, he closed his laptop, slid the deck aside, and placed both hands flat on the table the way one might steady a skittish animal. "No penalties for telling the truth," he said, voice low enough to calm the lights. "Walk me through what happened." The room changed temperature. Shame hates daylight. It prefers corners. He pulled the corner into the open and refused to turn it into a spectacle. Questions came patient, precise. He didn't search for a culprit. He searched for the shape of the problem, the points of pressure, the missing handoff. When the explanation trembled, he let silence hold it until it steadied. When blame tried to sneak in disguised as rigor, he intercepted it with the kind of rigor that builds instead of breaks. Care arrived without permission slips. Someone brought up impact. He brought up responsibility, then quietly spread it until no one stood alone beneath it. "We fixed this together," he said, and the pronoun did more healing than any policy ever had. Screens refreshed. The error revealed itself as errors often do. Ordinary, human, correctable. The fix was dull and blessedly so. No one was sacrificed for the sake of the story. After the meeting, the office exhaled into afternoon. Under the murmur of keyboards, a hum of relief moved like a current. He passed by my desk without ceremony and set down a cup of tea with the unstudied choreography of someone who has learned where words are insufficient. "Hot," he said, as if the adjective mattered more than the kindness. The cup warmed both hands, first a surprise, then a reminder. Warmth doesn't ask to be impressive. It asks to be given. Power sits differently when it is used to make room rather than to make points. In the days that followed, something in the spine stood taller without the assistance of pride. Not rescued, respected. Not shielded from work, equipped to do it. It is strange how competence can feel like affection when the world has trained you to expect scrutiny instead. The launch approached like weather. Nights stretched into slender hours that looked like morning. On the last rehearsal, the network hiccuped, and panic rehearsed its favorite scenes. He stepped into the doorway, not to direct, but to take count. "What do you need?" The question landed like the softest dare. Need is difficult for the tender-hearted. Asking is its own small act of faith. The list formed, practical and finite. He distributed tasks the way a good conductor hands the music back to the orchestra, aware of every strength, of every tired hand and still bright eye. There is a generosity that does not require an audience. It stands in the copy room unjamming the printer. It writes the thank you email at 2:07 a.m. It notices the junior analyst who always stays late and tells them to go home first. It also knows when to step away to keep dignity from feeling like debt. That balance taught more than any workshop ever could. Real care doesn't make you smaller to feel big. It makes you more yourself. When launch day finally stood in front of us, the building put on its crispest voice. Screens blinked into life. Chatter lifted like flocking birds. 100 moving parts aligned out of sheer stubborn grace. The moment arrived that always arrives, the one where the last unknown must be accepted as simply unknown. He looked over, and the look contained the yes of the whole day. "We've done what can be done." The rest is not a test of worth. We went live. The thing worked. Not flawlessly, honestly. Users found the edges and we sanded them as they walked. Feedback landed in bursts. Love this, fix that, what about? The team threaded the day with skill and humor. Somewhere between noon and relief, a small bouquet appeared on the break table with a handwritten note that didn't sign a name. as if gratitude were better as a chorus. Late, after handshakes and high fives had thinned, we found ourselves standing at the window where the city performs its favorite trick, turning everything into light. The office was a mosaic of empty chairs and abandoned sweaters. He leaned one shoulder against the glass, a posture that looked like temporary rest rather than fatigue. "Proud," he said, to the room, to the people no longer in it, to the work that had, for once, met the size of its intention. What happened next was nothing and everything. He held out a small wrapped lozenge, the kind he kept in his pocket for long days of speaking. The foil crinkled. Fingers touched for the barest moment, accidental, inevitable. The touch said something hands are better at saying than mouths: presence. Not possession, not promise, presence. And in that quiet exchange, the architecture of the past months rearranged itself in a way that asked to be named. It wasn't the forbidden that lent it power. It was the truth it revealed. Beneath titles, beneath meetings that trained the mouth to say only what it could afford, beneath decorum and its useful armor, lived something honest and startlingly simple. Care that didn't ask for permission, regard that didn't need a spotlight, affection that healed more than it complicated, that made the air easier to breathe. There had been fear of being seen, of being misread, of being right about something that might cost more than it gave. But fear has a sound, and it wasn't in the room. What was in the room sounded like quiet and tasted like rest. Not safety as the absence of risk, but safety as the presence of someone who will hold the frame while you decide what belongs inside it. People imagine turning points as fanfare. Mine arrived as a softness that refused to perform. He didn't confess anything. Neither did I. The confession already lived in the way we had worked, how feedback softened the blow without dulling the truth, how accountability refused to humiliate, how patience kept choosing to stand between pressure and the people carrying it. Love, if that's the word, had been busy long before romance considered showing up. Truth is stubborn. Once known, it doesn't disappear. It becomes a compass. The compass pointed away from spectacle, away from the kind of closeness that would undo what had been built. It pointed toward a wider definition, love as the courage to keep both the work and the person whole. Which meant boundaries, yes, but not as fences with barbed wire. As hedges living and tended that make a garden possible, there were choices to make. He made his first. A few days later, the reorg memo went out and he'd moved 2 levels sideways. Not down, not punished, repositioned. The rumor machine revved, hungry and uncreative. He never fed it. He said only what leaders say when they mean it. The team will be better served this way. The team was. My name was on more work. My work was better for being mine. Some connections rewrite what love is supposed to mean. They teach that love can step back and still be present, that it can prefer the health of the whole person over the thrill of a moment, that it can protect a future neither party can yet see. They do this quietly, completely, and, if blessed, forever. In time, distance changed shape. Not an absence, an avenue. We walked it with a steadiness that surprised me at first, and then didn't. The hello at the elevator remained a hello. The eye contact held, then released, with that same clean honesty. The regard never dimmed. It matured. If anyone asked, nothing happened. The truth is simpler. Something true kept happening, and we kept letting it be good. On a gray Friday months later, I passed his new floor on the way to a meeting. He was at the far end of the corridor, sleeves rolled, listening while someone younger than both of us tried to make sense of a diagram that didn't want to be understood. He pointed not to show off, but to guide. The younger one nodded, laughed at a fear that had just shrunk, and walked away taller. He looked up and saw me. The look that started it all returned, softer now, untroubled by what it was not allowed to be because it had decided what it must be. I pressed the elevator button and felt a familiar steadiness settle into place, the kind that keeps hands from shaking even when hearts insist on remembering. The doors opened. Inside, a mirror caught my face and returned it to me with something finer around the eyes. Not victory, not loss, a kind of peace that belongs to those who have chosen well. The moment that redefined love was not a kiss or a confession. It was a choice that let both of us become larger than our fear. If this story touched a hidden part of you, let it stay. Like, share, and subscribe for more moments that remind us how love still finds a way, even when it shouldn't. Because here, every ending isn't goodbye. It's a promise whispered through time.